Good morning and afternoon, everyone. We'll wait 2 more minutes and then start. Okay, so welcome everybody to the fourth event of the series Science-Based Tools for Financial Institutions. Given the urgent need of the financial sector to take effective climate action, UNDP FTSE-TPI is developing a series of webinars to present available instruments and tools that help address financial institutions, measure and align their financial flows with the relevant climate goals. Previous editions of this session, series, have covered the principles for climate-aligned finance, the UNEP Impact Analysis Methodology, and Carbon for Finance initiative. The UNDP FTSE-TPI Financial Centers for Sustainability Network is a global partnership among financial centers representing 82% of global equity market and $84 trillion equity market capitalization. Our objective is to accelerate the expansion of sustainable finance by enabling financial centers to evaluate and benchmark themselves and to provide tools and insights for them to engage with local financial institutions and inform policy. In this way, we ultimately help drive market transformation. At FTSE-TPI, we believe it is essential to promote spaces like this, where the significance of accomplishing the Paris Agreement is the focus, and where we can support the collective commitment to build resilience throughout the planet. Today's session will showcase the TPI, or Transition Pathway Initiative Center, which is a global initiative that assesses companies' preparedness for the transition to a low carbon economy. It is led by asset owners and supported by asset managers, service providers, and nonprofits, and it covers 479 companies across 16 sectors with a total market cap of $10 trillion. It provides the Climate Action 100 Plus benchmark to assess 167 of the most carbon intensive and regional significant companies, and its data has been embedded into the Financial Times Stock Exchange TPI Climate Transition Index, and it is increasingly referenced by the London Stock Exchange. TPI has 124 supporters in total, with combined assets under management of $45 trillion. Without further ado, I want to introduce you to our eminent speaker for today. Beata Wieniawska. She's the Deputy Research Lead and Project Lead for TPI. She has over 13 years experience working across the public sector on national level and at a European level, as well as academia. Most recently, she served as a program manager at the University of Cambridge CISL Accelerator, leading the Innovators for Change Acceleration Program. Prior to this, her focus was on developing policies and dialogues and supporting businesses in the area of energy and climate and economics while working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the European External Action Service. This session will be followed by a Q&A panel, and we invite you to participate and drop your questions in the chat box, as well as to raise your hand to be considered a microphone to engage in interactive dialogue. So without further ado, Beata, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francia. Thank you for the opportunity. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to some of you, and good evening, probably also to some of you. So it is my pleasure to present you today the TPI Global Climate Transition Center's online tool, about which I'll be talking. And firstly, I will focus on presenting you our main objective of the center, which is focused on assessing the publicly listed equities, how we do this. And then I will pass to the second major projects that we have at the TPI Center, and this is the assessment of the banks. And however, before this, I want to introduce you a little bit into the TPI word. And next slide, please. And next slide. So most of the issues I have on my first slide have been already covered by Francia, so I won't be going into repeating them. However, you need to know that TPI's Transition Pathway Initiative has been established by asset owners and then supported by asset managers back in 2017. And since that time, building on its success, so we have been growing with every single year. We have grown into the number of having 131 supporters with combined 50 trillion under asset management and advice. We have decided that it's time to scale up. And why the Transition Pathway Initiative it transformed into the TPI Limited. Its academic partner, so the research team based at London School of Economics Grantham Research Institute, has been scaled up into TPI Global Climate Transition Center as of June this year. You might not have heard a lot about this in the news yet, because we are organizing the launch event, which will come at the end of October, and we are preparing all the press releases and communication around the TPI Center. We will continue to deliver what we have delivered so far, so the assessment of the corporates on a transition to a low carbon economy, and our data will continue to be embedded in such a products like FTSE-TPI Climate Transition Index, and in the in other indices, and other financial products created. So we are looking at the possibility of commercialization of the research outputs, however, with the thinking behind that the primary objective of the Transition Pathway Center's TPI online tool is to be publicly available and to produce publicly available data methodologies. Next slide, please. So here you see our entire pathway. We started back in 2017, only assessing 100 companies from 3 energy sectors. And on a year-on-year basis, we have been increasing the coverage in terms of the sectors and in terms of the companies, ending this year, hopefully, with assessing up to 600 companies from 17 sectors. And this is also how we build it up. We have received a number of awards in the meantime, which have confirmed in a way to us that what we are doing really serves investors' needs. Next slide, please. And to get what is the TPI Global Climate Transition Center, you can check it on our homepage, which has been already updated as per the center. But just to give you this kind of the overall definition, we are authoritative and independent source of research and data in the progress of the companies and other institutions being assessed on the transition to a low carbon economy. So transparency and independent analysis is at the heart of our action, and we are serving with this the investors and their decision making. We are also assessing the companies, and we are on the transition to net zero to give investors the information how they should align their portfolios with net zero targets. So we are serving this purpose. We are working together with our data partner, and the major one is the FTSE Russell. And with the FTSE Russell, we deliver most of the data related to the assessment of corporates. However, we are also working with other partners. So we are working with Asset Owners Alliance, IAGCC, Ceres, and PRI on the number of projects, which I will mention in a second. And as Florentia mentioned, we are supporting Climate Action 100 Plus with the assessment, with development of the methodology, but also and of the benchmark, and also with the assessment of 167 most carbon-intensive companies. Next slide, please. So our aim is to get from the point A where we are now, so from assessing around 600 companies, you will see on the TPI online tool that we are assessing at the moment 479 companies, and this year we're going to be adding new companies to the universe. However, our next update planned in the coming week, within the next days, is update on the carbon performance and management quality of the energy companies. This will be the same universe as we assessed last year, minus Russian companies. And this has been the position taken by TPI that due to the current situation, we are temporarily excluding assessment of the Russian companies. However, from this point, we're going to get in the next 3 years to the coverage of 10,000 companies across the sectors. How we will achieve this? Basically, we have divided the companies or the listed equities into 3 groups. The first group, Climate Action 100 companies already mentioned, they will be given the intensive assessment and also very in-depth assessment. So we are, apart from assessing those companies against the general and sector agnostic benchmark, C100 benchmark, we are also considering adding net zero sectoral standards, like the net zero oil and gas sectoral standards. So it means very in-depth analysis of the company's performance on the sectoral benchmark. The second group will be listed equities assessed once a year, and this will be around 800 companies. There are at the moment around 600 companies, so will be scaled up to 800, covered by the management quality and carbon performance methodology. So 2 key methodologies developed by the TPI Center. And then we're going to move to the third category, which is wider universe of companies. And this is basically addressing what investors have asked us for quite a long time, saying that we want ideally to cover our entire portfolio of companies that we have, so that we can make a portfolio level judgment, and this will be the attempt to do so. So we will be developing so-called simplified carbon performance assessment, and we will be assessing this universe against this methodology and the management quality as well. So this is the first group. The other group are other asset classes. So while the banks are not other asset class, we are adding banks to the assessment. However, we have already started also adding corporate bond issuers to the assessment. So we cover them with the same methodology as listed equities, because we do see across sectors a lot of overlap between equities and bond issuers, at least at the top level. However, we will look into development of bespoke bond duration methodology for this group. The sovereign bonds, at the moment, we are in the middle of the project, which is called the ASCO project, to develop bespoke benchmarks, so bespoke framework assessing countries and sovereign bonds issuers, those issuing sovereign bonds on climate change and on the transition to a low carbon economy. We will do it while looking at the policies, at the emission targets, and the funding needs. So these are the 3 building blocks that we are looking at, and we are working together with investors and co-creating the framework with investors. at the very moment, because even today we had a few hours ago meeting with them. And finally, towards the third year of the centre's existence, we'll go into private markets to see what kind of methodologies can help investors to assess those. Apart from this, we are planning to develop something like a transition knowledge hub. So this kind of a platform on which we can exchange views with the investors and with everyone interested on the transition to low carbon economy, when we can explain our methodologies, when we explain the major trend and issues we spot on the market. And all these efforts are destined for one single aim, of course, not single, major, maybe aim to ensure that this new center will become a key part of a post COP26 financial infrastructure, and will be supporting investors into assessing credibly the company's pathway to net zero and the country's pathways and others. Next slide, please. And this is what you see when you go to the TPI Centre's online tool website. So basically, we have this 4 categories at the moment, our 4 major projects. You can check on our website. If you go to public listed equities, you will be shown the summary of on the sectoral level and on a company level. So for each company, we publish the management quality and carbon performance score on a year-to-year basis. Corporate bond issuers now will have those which we have added to our universe will be assessed again as well on the management quality and carbon performance. Banks, you will see that we have already assessed 27 banks on our methodology, which was released in in July this year. And sovereign bonds issuers, you will find only the information where we are with the projects, because the release of this project is planned for September next year. Next slide, please. And how can investors use the TPI Centre's online tool to inform their impacts? There are a number of ways, as you see here. Mostly they are doing it for voting, so to inform their voting decision, to engage with companies, for ESG integration, for exclusions, for demonstrating commitment and product creation. But are they really doing it? And we will find it out on the next slide. So this was our idea how they can be using, and this is how, apologies, next slide. And this slide shows if they are really doing it. So here you're going to see that Rebecca is using our data to guide their engagements on climate change. And similar, USSS is using our data to inform their voting and engagement. While Aberdeen is using our data to identify transition leaders and laggards, which again help them to set high benchmarks in terms of the leaders and to engage with laggards. The Church of England is a special case, the Church of England Pensions Board, because together with FTSE, they have created the TPI data index. They have embedded the TPI data to create the index. So this is this kind of permanent case of using the data. While Brunel, for example, is setting up the portfolio level benchmarks in order in what is the percentage of portfolio which should be aligned with a given benchmark that we have for carbon performance, like 1.5 degrees, for example. Next slide. And now we will deep dive into the TPI Centre methodology for publicly listed companies. So this is how our TPI process looks like. We are focusing entirely on the company disclosure published in the public space. And this is a big principle that we have been following from the beginning on, and we're going to stick to this. So basically, we are looking at the companies, not at anything sent to companies themselves that is privately disclosed, but only at the information which is existing in the public space. Companies' sustainability reports, financial reports, annual reports, CSR reports, and others. And this is used by FTSE to create the management quality scores. And this is used by our research team at the TPI Centre to create the carbon performance scores. And this data, including the methodologies, is published then on the TPI online tool, because this is yet another principle that all our research deliverables are made public, to the degree that if you have taken the management quality or carbon performance methodologies, if you look into them, you can easily replicate them on your own. So, and hopefully with this information that we are sharing, and we are talking to investors how to make our data more usable in the future, and we are exploring also new data environment, because now you can download all our data on, from the website in form of the spreadsheets. We are looking into more modern solutions and up-to-date solutions like Snowflake, which will allow for much more much better communication between our systems than only spreadsheets. Next slide, please. And I told you about management quality and carbon performance, but what I mean by those two methodologies, they're important to be treated together and look at together, because why management quality is looking at the company's governance of greenhouse gas emissions and risk and opportunities arising from the low carbon transition, so like the climate governance related issues. The carbon performance is looking at the company emission reduction targets and is benchmarking them against the sectoral benchmarks developed by us based on IEA scenarios in most of the sectors. Next slide. And with this management quality, we cover all our sectors assessment. So the 16 sectors at the 17 sectors at the moment, because food is included there, and soon we're going to be expanding also to the new sectors. So at the moment we are developing a number of methodologies to expand. And with carbon performance, we are covering most of our sectors, but not all of them due to some methodological issues. However, the research team is working hard to crack all the methodological issues. And soon you will see that we will be adding a food carbon performance methodology and assessment of food companies into our universe. We are working at the moment at chemicals and other industrials methodologies. We are also looking into development of absolute emissions methodology as oil and gas distribution and coal. So as you see here, most of our sectors are high emitting sectors, because this is how we select the sectors that we are expanding. And they are built within 3 clusters: energy cluster, transport cluster, industrial and material cluster. So when we'll be looking into adding new sectors, it will be again based on emissions. And when we are adding companies, it is important we are looking at the market cap and their activity boundary, so feasibility of performing carbon performance for them assessment. And we are not accepting any site requests from investors or companies to be added to the list or to be deleted from the list. So we remain this kind of independent authority, which basically goes through the list and puts the name of companies on the list, which we're going to assess in the current year. However, we do engage with companies at one point in time in the research process. So first, our first FTSE Russell proposed the management quality first assessment. We do the same with the carbon performance assessment. And then we share those 2 scores with companies. We give them 3 weeks and we ask them, if there are any inaccuracies in our assessment, please come back to us and flag them to us. However, this cannot be information disclosed to us privately. It needs to be backed up by the source which is published in the public domain. Next slide, please. Next slide talks about our stairs that we made from the 100 companies to, at the moment, 600 companies, hopefully 800 companies in the next years, and more added new sectors. Next slide. And a little bit more on the management quality. As I told you that we are assessing climate governance practices of companies. So we have at the moment 19 indicators which are spread across 5 levels, from level 0, unaware, through level 2, building capacity, to level 4, strategic assessment. And we see a lot of distribution between levels 0 and 1 in emerging countries and a lot of level 3 and 4 in developed countries, to the degree that we are considering in the next year adding level 5 in order to increase the ambition level. And with the management quality, we are looking into a number of specific things related to the climate governance, including the whether the company has set emission reduction targets, whether it relates to its scope 3 emissions, if this is applicable, like in oil and gas sector, whether a company has a process to manage climate-related risks, or whether its remuneration against the climate change. So these are the number of 19 metrics that we check. Next slide, please. And here's our carbon performance assessment, which does the alignment of company targets, and these are the short, medium, and long-term targets, with the UN Paris Agreement goals. So with the use of IA scenarios in most of the sectors, we have developed 3 main benchmarks. National pledges, which is the benchmark that is very useful, especially with the companies from the emerging markets. However, it's not sufficient to limit global warming to 2 degrees or below. So it's the least ambitious scenario that we have. Then we have a below 2 degrees benchmark, which is consistent with holding the global temperature increase to below 1.8 degrees Celsius, and 1.5 degrees, which is consistent with holding the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what we are basically doing, we are adjusting the benchmarks to the sectors, and you can find our sectoral methodologies being published on the TPI Center's website. And we are then checking if the company which has set a target, how it relates to the benchmarks from its sector. So whether it is on the pathway to reach net zero by 2050, and how its pathway looks like in the meantime, so in the short and medium term. Next slide, please. And however, in answering the question, is the company aligned with the Paris goals? We are taking the company emission intensity in the last year, for which we have the data with the benchmarks at the end of the horizon. And if the company has set a 2050 target, we just compare the level of emission intensity. If it has not set the target itself, we take the company's latest historical emission intensity and we compare it with the benchmark intensities in the 2050. It is important that if company sets absolute emissions targets, we just convert it to emissions intensity. If it has set within different metrics than we are using, we are just converting it. So for majority of the companies we assess, we are able to produce the carbon performance assessment. So you see here the case of 3 companies. You see, and those who are setting the long-term targets, here we have in the middle the company E with the 2050 target, which basically eventually place itself on the pathway to 1.5 degrees all the way through. And the other company, which has much shorter target of 2045, is basically going through a number of benchmarks, but eventually does not align with any of our benchmarks. Next slide, please. And I told you a little bit about the TPI sectoral decarbonization pathways that we have for our sectors. And here you see in the table the list of all our sectors that we cover with our pathways, for which we have developed our pathways. You can also see that most of them have already the same types of benchmarks. If they don't have yet, we are working on it with my team to crack and to ensure that by the end of the year, hopefully early next year, all the benchmarks will be the same across sectors. It's not easy due to the IA availability of the scenarios. And we are covering, of course, the related scope of emissions. So in our approach, we create sector-specific methodologies based on the sectoral decarbonization approach. We benchmark most emissions in the sectors against IA scenarios. We don't do it now for the outers because there is no such a methodology. However, we are looking into ways of creating the same benchmarks. Our benchmarks cover the majority of the life cycle emissions in each sector, and our all benchmarks extend to 2050. So this allows investors compare the companies across sectors and in the short, medium, and long term. Next slide. And there is one special case that we have among our sectors. These are utilities, and because of the utility specificity that usually they operate locally, we have used IEA regional scenarios to develop regional benchmarks for them. And here you're going to see that we have developed 4 benchmarks, and which helped us to address the issue of common but differentiated responsibilities, in which basically the high emitting nations, and especially those who have historically emitted a lot of emissions, are responsible to decarbonize faster now than the other nations, the developing nations. So you're going to see that why the benchmark for European Union says you need to decarbonize into you need to reach net zero to be aligned with 1.5 by 2035. That for the developing nations, the benchmark are much more extended to the future. Next slide. And we increasingly say what we have stated in our last report, State of Transition, our flagship report, that not only the endpoint matters, but the entire pathway to net zero, which means that investors should be looking at the short, medium, and long-term alignment of a company. Because increases in global temperatures depends on cumulative CO2 emissions. It means that if we see some sectors like autos backloading their efforts to 2040 or late 2040s, it means they are putting a lot of pressure on the carbon budget. Therefore, ideally, that the pathway to net zero should look sustainable for a company and at the sustainable pace. That's why we thought it's very critical for us to capture what the pathway looks like. So we not only state that the alignment in those 3 periods, as you see on the picture above, but we also note on the company pathway, which is featured on every single company website that we assess on carbon performance. And we note whether the company has set short-term, medium-term, or long-term targets, so that investor can get this information and see how the pathway to net zero looks like. Next slide, please. And this is like very in a nutshell introduction to it was the introduction to our methodologies and how we assess the corporates on a transition to a low carbon economy. Now I will give you some snapshots on how we what is our approach to banks and their transition. This has been a project which we have started about 2 years ago with IIGCC. They have a huge engagement initiative related to banks. And we came in to develop, as an academic partner, to develop a framework and to assess banks on their transition to low carbon economy. However, as we did it with our main TPI centers tool for public listed equity, still the principle for us has been to develop the tool together with investors and for investors to co-create the tool definitely together from the beginning till the end. That's why the investors have been at the heart of the process, and through a number of round tables and consultations, they have provided us feedback which help us to iterate the tool a number of times. And this tool basically is meant to inform investors about the climate-related efforts taken already by banks as they transition to net zero. And we think that while there are many existing tools in the marketplace, the fact that this is the first investor-led banking tool, and especially that all our assessments and the methodology is published in the public space, it's critical point and point of value. Next slide, please. So how is the tool organized? We are looking into a number of sections, which are basically, or the areas, which are similar, at least we try to make them look similar for the easiness, for not to create additional complexity, similar to net zero IGCC net zero investment framework implementation guide, and also similar to climate action 100 plus. What was driving us in setting up the areas and indicators and sub-indicators was a document prepared at the beginning of the entire process by IGCC together with investor expectations. In fact, in this document, basically investors have laid out what is the level of ambition we should be looking for in the framework, and what kind of indicators, what kind of areas we should assess the banks against. So our first section is focused on the commitment. So the commitment to net zero. And when I say commitment, we're very explicit about this. So no language on the aim or anything that is kind of seems very soft in the nature. Plan to reach net zero is accepted. Only the hard commitments by banks. Then we are looking into targets, and these are short, medium, and long-term targets. And then we are looking into the decarbonization strategy, so how banks are looking to implement and to realize their plans for hitting their targets. So in this, we are looking for engagement and capital allocation, exposure and finance emission disclosure, and climate scenario analysis. We are also then looking at the climate policy and engagement, climate governance, audit, and accounts. And we have, within all those sections and indicators, we have more than 60 sub-indicators at the moment. So it's a very huge framework. We have just entered the second round of consultations of the framework with investors again. We'll be looking into simplifying the framework and maybe reducing the number of sub-indicators, but only when there is solid justification. So there will be no we are not looking to decrease the ambition level. We are rather looking to make it still even more relevant as a tool for investors to be used in the assessment of banks. And we are planning the publication of the results in early 2023, and then doing the reassessment of banks. Next slide, please. So we thought that when creating the tool that is investor-led, we have to find the clear points of value of this framework. And this are definitely, we think, our focus on targets. So evaluating the ambition of net zero finance emission targets. So we have focused on measuring short, medium, and long-term alignment across the entire portfolios, but also we gave there a lot of granularity. So, for example, we are checking whether the targets are met in all sectors within one activity, or in one sector, but across all banks' activities. And I will talk about the insight from this research very soon. Then I told you about the investor-driven tool, so that there's another key point of value of the framework. We have also added novel indicators, and these are the indicators focused on capital allocation and sector-specific policies. So what we have seen within the framework, what has been important to investors when looking at banks, it was the finance withdrawal from high-emitting sectors, and how banks engage with clients' transition plans. So especially the first indicator, which I have mentioned, withdrawal from high-emitting sectors. We have looked into the fossil fuels. We have looked into the bank's efforts on ending deforestation or the land use. So number of criteria. And finally, to think about scaling and optimizing this framework against already existing tools, but not bespoke for banks. We were looking for the alignment with the CA 100 framework, and especially you can see it in the audit and account section, which is basically modeled based on the CA 100 benchmark. Next slide, please. On this slide, you see the overall performance of the banks of 27 global, one of the biggest banks in the world, assessed on our framework. And this assessment proves that all of the banks are doing some efforts, and actually some of the banks are leaders in certain areas, that overall the effort is not sufficient enough. So as you can see, no, the 50% of the threshold hasn't been not been passed by on average by the banks on any of the sections. There are a few leading banks, however, still we see that banks are lagging behind the corporate world. On the other hand, you need to be aware, and I need to stress it, that this benchmark has been developed recently. So when investors learned how much we should be demanding from the financial sector in terms of decarbonization, and we started from really high ambition. And in terms of the findings, we have found that a significant number of banks have published net zero commitments. Fewer have published short and medium-term targets, which is also pertinent to corporates. However, the problem with those commitments and targets is the coverage of banks' activities, as well as high emission economic sectors within the targets. Because either we see banks are, for example, taking the practice of focusing only on the loan book. In some of the cases, this is the majority of their activity, but not always. And then they cover most of the high emitting sectors, but there are omission in terms of the sectors, and there are omissions done in terms of the activities. We have to be fair that there are still a number of methodologies lacking, which could help banks to cover all sectors. So this is something which is in development. Then client engagement and sectoral policies are not yet aligned with banks' emission reduction targets or 1.5 degree scenario. We found that also that disclosure of exposure to high emitting sectors and finance emission is still limited, mostly to the loan book. We also pointed out that most banks have allocated oversight of climate change and climate risk management to the highest level of governance. However, the executive remuneration is not yet tied to the finance emission targets. And finally, the worst performance are climate policy engagements and audit and accounts sections, on which indicators show very weak performance of banks in this areas. And with this, I'm mindful of the time that we are left with 50 minutes for the discussion. I will close this presentation. I have some additional information for you in terms of the performance of the public listed equities in our sectors on the transition to low carbon economy. However, I think I already overloaded you with lots of information today, so I'm really happy to take questions.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Beata. That was really insightful. We do have a question, and I encourage attendees to drop more questions on the chat box or to raise their hands and be given the word. So Victor Gonzalez is asking, are companies being evaluated with public data, or can they input data? How did you reduce the level of subjectivity of the indicators? By the way, this is an excellent initiative. I wonder if this methodology is related to the ACT methodology produced by Adam France, the French brand, in partnership with CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. I don't know if you know the ACT methodology. Well, basically that's the question.
I'm happy to take this question. So you're not accepting any private sources of information. So there are a number of initiatives like SBTI, which basically say, okay, this is how you can, here you can feedback us with your data. We do not allow this because it will mean that we are not based on public disclosure, and we want to enhance disclosure of the data and transparency in the public space. That's why we have been also taking active role in the TCFD consultations on targets and metrics last year, when we have stated how companies should be disclosing the data on targets in terms of the emissions, activity, organizational boundary, and ideally on offsets as well. So all in all, we only accept if even if we give the feedback window to companies and say, please come back if you spotted any inaccuracies. If there is some additional data that we haven't seen on your website, it still needs to be sourced to the publicly available information, which can be either one of the reports that I have mentioned, but also it can be embedded somewhere on the company's website, but it needs to be made public. And I think it's a very important principle, because the lack of information and both on corporates and on banks that we see is staggering. At the same time, we see a lot of year-on-year improvement in the information disclosed by companies. In terms of how we developed our methodology, so the basic carbon performance and management quality, it's more of it was based on the sectoral decarbonization approach, which has been the methodology in terms of carbon performance developed by SBTI. So we are taking from the others, we are learning from the others. However, eventually, this was this kind of co-creative efforts done together with investors and with FTSE Russell in terms of the management quality, putting up the framework together, and of carbon performance of the LSE research team.
Thank you, Beata. There's one more question from Iliana Griva. What scenarios will you be basing your assessment on for new sectors, for example, food, given that IEA does not develop data on that front?
Of course. So we are looking for scenarios in a number of places. So for example, for autos, we have been using IACCT, and you will see in our, if you go to our sectoral decarbonization report, which was published January this year, what are the sources that we use in every single sector, because we cross-reference them. So you will see within the food, yet I don't want to disclose at the stage anything, because we are still at the stage of when we did the first in history assessment of the food companies on carbon performance methodology. Now we are engaging with them to get their feedback, and then we will be polishing our final outcome, and we will publish a discussion paper on this. However, we are looking for credible scenarios as well beyond IEA. So ideally, we will be based on everything that is disclosed, also somehow available publicly. So the biggest challenges for us at the moment with the scenarios and that data under the ASCO project. For the banking project, it has been quite easy, because basically we see that banks are using similar sectoral decarbonization scenarios, which are, for example, developed by IEA, so in order to set targets for their sectors.
Perfect. Thank you. I've got another question from Caroline Avan. It reads, are you planning to integrate an assessment of corporate performance with regard to human rights and social impacts of the transition? In your view, at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, climate and emissions corporate governance also need to encompass those dimensions. Sorry, that's the view of the Business and Human Rights Resources Center.
Thank you for this question. And we're going to continue our focus on climate change specifically. So we already had a number of questions about biodiversity, which we have been including in terms of the some sub-indicators, I would say, like the ending of the land use and deforestation. However, our key driver will remain the climate change. At the same time, we are evolving as an initiative. So it means that, for example, at the moment we are working on the development of climate action benchmark version 2.0, which will include the just transition indicator. So we will be then, once this is finalized, we'll be looking within our management quality on the possibility to embed it within the framework. And the same we're going to then replicate for banks, because we know that there is this kind of demand for looking at the just transition. And within the just transition, we can tap on some issues related to human rights, to the situation of the workers. However, it won't be maybe as much as exposed as you'd like to prefer. However, this is the way that it's coming ideally from climate. So everything is related very close to the climate itself. And hopefully this at least is somehow satisfying that just transition indicators as something that is coming in the perspective of next year, hopefully.
Indeed, I'm really anxious to look at the indicators that you use to track that. Well, given the latest, let's say, updates from the IFRS, I would like to ask you if you think of, I mean, how do you think that the IFRS, let's say, new standards, sustainability standards, will kind of shape or let's say, will affect or impact the work at the TPI Center?
Actually, what is I would say we are on the way towards we have set out the plan for the next 3 years already for the TPI Center, what we're going to do and how we're going to get there. So the biggest impact that we are seeing comes usually from the update of the scenarios. So Florencia, while we are recognizing the other efforts happening in the space, what has hugely impacted us were two facts recently. One was the IEA coming with net zero scenario, because we have been able to get rid of the benchmarks which seemed a little bit like redundant. We had the 2 degrees and below 2 degrees. We have updated those to the 1.5 degrees and below 2 degrees, but really below 2 degrees, so 1.8 degrees, and stay with national pledges, but still updated. And the second fact, this has been TCFD negotiations, because consultations, apologies, because we have seen that them as opportunity to influence the thinking of how the corporate emission targets should be released by the companies. So what is the most influential from our point of view is better reporting standards, and we believe that TCFD has acquired a huge power as this kind of global setting standard body, and hopefully we're going to see more and more tight on the way how the companies should report their targets. However, everything that is related and that is enhancing the reporting, it's helpful on our end. And everything, and we also read the UK from COP26 commitments, and basically the ambition set the companies need to publish their transition plans by 2023, and they need to report better as a way helping us out to assess their companies, because ultimately we're a tool for investors. So we are creating some kind of information, and we give them the power to use it the way they think it's useful for them.
Thank you, Beata. That's really clear. Also, the TCFD is a longer, let's say, has a longer trajectory. So in that sense, it is more established at the moment. So that was really, really insightful. I have another question. I don't know, it might be a bit more technical, but it relates to the national, when you kind of compare with the national strategy scenario. How do you, I mean, how do you trace the company? Like, how do you assign the companies to the countries? Let's say, do you use the headquarters, or like, how is that part done?
Yeah, so it's not easy with companies, because sometimes it's very, very fluid in terms of the activity, organizational and activity boundary. However, we are looking at the companies from where they have their headquarters, but also where they have their major activity, most of the activity, and then we can assign them. And I have to be also clear that we are working together with FTSE Russell on the data. So basically we are also guided by their principle, how they allocate the companies to the countries.
Perfect. I see, sorry, there are more questions. So do companies are obligated to allow the analysis on their whole operations, or they can choose regions or branch? Well, this is something pretty similar to what I've asked. I don't know if you
So
have something to add.
basically, we are looking at the corporate level. So we are looking at the entirety of companies' operations. So, for example, this is a huge challenge for us in the carbon performance assessment when we see the targets being disclosed against, for example, some regions. So the company sets targets only for Europe in terms of the carbonization, but not for the rest of the world. So in terms of we can't accept this kind of targets because we're always looking at the corporate level. So it has to be the target which is set for all the activities across all the geographies.
Perfect. And last question, it reads from Johannes Heidbrink on banks. Do you provide a consolidated figure or grade combining all relevant indicators or the percentile in the universe that was covered? A leader laggard criteria like indicator?
Yeah, Johannes, thank you for this question. Very, very good question. Something that I need to mention. So at the moment we have published a pilot framework and we have published pilot assessment of 27 banks. It means that we haven't yet aggregated these scores because we thought that for a pilot, it's not the best approach. It's a better approach to show the specific indicator by indicator performance and section level performance. However, we are at the moment working with our partners on the scoring of banks and the scoring methodology. So when we're going to publish the final results of banks, and it will be before the AGM season next year, so we are hoping to do this before April or early April, then we will already look at the scoring of banks. We won't flag them as leaders or laggards, although I really like this comparison, and we have that in our state of transition reports in relation to the corporates. However, here we're going to have either the percentage, either the grade given, and we haven't yet defined whether it would look like similar to our management quality staircase that we are putting the companies on, or whether it will be a simple scoring based either on the sections as in the CU Climate Action 100 plus, or just the bank-wide score.
Okay, thank you, Beata. I have to wrap up the session. So thank you. It was an honor to have you on this panel. We're immensely grateful at FTSE for making this session a success, and we look forward to working together with you and our network members. Thank you to all attendees for being here today. We hope this webinar has been valuable for you, and we invite you to share this information with your colleagues. You can find more information on upcoming webinars at www.fc4s.org, and you will be receiving a follow-up email after this session. Thank you and have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Florencia. Thank you for listening to this lengthy presentation. I hope it was insightful for you, and have a good rest of the day. Bye.